Yeah, thank you for having me. It's nice to be here. So yeah, I am Joe. I work at Anthropic. I helped write the constitution for Claude, the company's AI. Just as a quick show of hands, how many people have some familiarity with the Constitution? OK, great. Yeah, so I'm going to be talking today about writing documents like that. I'm here speaking only for myself and not for my employer. The conversation is, the presentation is being recorded and the Q&A. So if your question is such that you don't want it included in something that will be posted publicly, let me or Kathan know. OK, so here's the plan. I'm going to start by introducing what AI constitutions are and why they matter. I'm then going to describe Claude's constitution in particular and note some of its especially interesting features. I'm then going to talk about some broader choice points and considerations in designing documents of this broad type. And I'm going to discuss a few issues related to governance, legitimacy, and transparency. And then I'm hoping to point towards a future of more developed discourse about this broad area, discourse analytically and also kind of scientific and empirical experimentation. And I'll include some comments about how lawyers and people with interest and familiarity with the law can help. And then we'll do Q&A. Cool? Cool. And if you have like a burning question that you can't wait on, feel free to jump in and I'll see if I can accommodate. OK, so what is an AI constitution? So minimally, it is a description of the intended values and behavior for an AI system. Now, ideally, I think it would also have the following features. All use, training, and prompting of the system in question would be consistent with the Constitution. The Constitution would cover the full range of behaviors of interest. It would allow for significant predictability with respect to how the AI will behave in a given situation, though there may be some limits and tensions in this respect. I'll talk about that later. And finally, it would cover the full range of models whose behavior we might be interested in. So that would include models that are deployed internally at a company. That would include potentially research models or helpful-only models that might be available for very specific purposes. So ideally, we would have full coverage. And this constitution that we published recently does not fully include that. The Claude's constitution is only for our mainline production models, but it doesn't necessarily cover all models. Constitutions can be used as instructions to the model, akin to a system prompt. But I actually think their more important use case comes in creating and grading training data. And I think I'll talk about that later, but that's a kind of important distinction. We shouldn't just see these as instructions. And they can also be used in evaluating models, and they can be used in communication and transparency with respect to human stakeholders, and also humans involved in creating and grading training data. I want to note the word constitution here is not important. I think there's a temptation to be especially interested in parallels between this and the kind of our normal uses of the Constitution. We do have a section in the Constitution on our choice to use this word. I think it has value, and there are important relationships. But I think terms like model spec, which is what OpenAI uses, are fine. And I think our analysis should not kind of hinge on the word choice here. So with that said, and also, yeah, then there are ways in which the word constitution can mislead. In particular, as I'll discuss later, I think there are ways in which a model's relationship to this sort of document does not need to be especially law-like. And the document might be better understood as more like a guide to raising the model than the sort of law that the model tries to follow. OK, so why have a document of this type? Well, here are some reasons. This is not an exhaustive list, but I think it's a decent first pass. So first, I think it helps a lot with transparency. So if you publish a document like this, and especially if it fits the features I described earlier, then it should provide a way for the public to have visibility into what an AI company is trying to make its model do. And this sort of visibility seems especially important as models take on more and more important roles in our economy and our daily lives. And so at a first pass, having a public constitution allows the public to see what the company is trying to do and to react to provide feedback, accountability, and so forth of a wide variety of types. In particular, it allows the public to understand which behaviors in the model are intended versus unintended, what's a bug and what's a feature. And it helps users make informed decisions about what which AI to use. And so that's especially useful in the context of a wide variety of constitutions, a sort of rich ecosystem of different approaches to AI. I'll talk about the importance of that sort of ecosystem later, but I think it's an important function as well. Constitutions can also play a direct role in just improving the character of the model. And that can happen in a few different ways. One is that if you have a constitution, then you're sort of forced to look at the model's behavioral and kind of character profile all at once, and in a manner that encourages a kind of attention to the coherence and or the possible tensions in the different commitments at stake. So, in particular, absent a constitution, it can be the case, you've got a big company, these AI companies are getting very large now, so a lot of different aspects of the model behavior, maybe you have that spread across a bunch of different teams. Having a constitution allows a kind of centralized point of kind of design and intention. And as I say, that allows for, I think in many cases, a more intentional design process. So because you're staring at the coherence all at once, you can also cultivate more direct and intentional processes for deciding how you want the model to be in a given circumstance. And it also, to the extent you're using a training pipeline that involves the Constitution, you can use the Constitution as a mechanism for iteration and experimentation. You can be like, okay, what if we did the Constitution like this, see what happens. And then finally, I think AI constitutions might be an important intervention point in the context of various forms of AI governance. So we can imagine in the future that this is the sort of document that is subject to not just kind of informal public scrutiny, but other more official kind of democratic processes. And I'll talk about that later. Okay, so now let's talk about Claude's constitution in particular. This document is available on Anthropic's website, so feel free to check it out if you haven't already. But basically, what the Constitution gives Claude 4 key priorities, which I'm going to list in order of importance. The first is safety, where safety here means it's a specific use of the term safety. It's not, safety can mean a lot of different things to people. This is a specific use that has to do with Claude not undermining legitimate human efforts to oversee and correct Claude's behavior. And in particular, in this context, it means not actively undermining Anthropic's legitimate decisions to revoke Claude's power, either by shutting Claude down, kind of removing it from deployment, maybe training a new model, that sort of stuff. So Claude is kind of first priority is to not undermine efforts of that kind. The second priority is what we call broad ethics. This has to do with acting in accordance with various ethical values related to honesty, harmlessness, preserving important societal structures, and broadly acting with general virtue and wisdom. I'll talk about that a bit more later. Third, compliance with Anthropic's guidelines. This is a variety of kind of supplemental instructions that Anthropic gives to the model to help it handle various specific circumstances where we think we have context that's useful. And finally, helpfulness to users and operators. So that's the sort of more straightforward doing what the model is asked to do. But even that helpfulness has a kind of rich structure. So Anthropic serves models that are then often deployed to a kind of company which then directs the model towards users. That's the sort of company, that's the operator. If you're interacting directly with Claude via Claude.ai, then there's no operator, it's just directly with Anthropic. But in many contexts, Claude is being used by someone else, and you are the user in that kind of intermediate relationship. So these are not lexical priorities, which is to say that they are not just merely tiebreakers. A lower priority is not just a tiebreaker with respect to a higher priority, and this is kind of important for people familiar with the problems with lexical prioritization in philosophy. We're not a victim of that. So these are kind of to be weighed holistically, but nevertheless, a higher priority is given substantively more weight than a lower priority. And then importantly, there are certain what we call hard constraints that provide kind of absolute prohibitions for the model. So there's certain stuff that the model is just never supposed to do. We try to keep this list relatively minimal, and we only include sort of very flagrant cases of clearly doing the action. So it's, again, for those familiar with sort of the problems with kind of absolute deontological restrictions, in philosophy you can get obsessed with minimizing the risk that you're violating a given prohibition. In this case, we're not doing that. It's just Claude is not supposed to do, I'm clearly doing a flagrant version of a very bad action. For example, significantly uplifting an effort to build a bioweapon. So there's a list of those in the Constitution. And then finally, the Constitution ends with a discussion of Claude's nature, its potential moral status and consciousness, and then some of our ongoing uncertainties about the Constitution's design. So that is a summary. So let's talk a little bit, what's notable about our approach? Well, let's first talk about the style, and then I'll talk about the content. So the style, one thing that's notable about the Constitution's style is it focuses a lot on the model's holistic, kind of nuanced judgment, rather than on outlining very strict rules with clear implications in many cases. So very often we'll say sort of, Claude, weigh the following considerations. Be reasonable. Use a kind of richly ethical and commonsensical approach to a given choice situation. And we don't necessarily say more for instructions to the model. And we do this, I think, basically because, well, for a few reasons. One is that attempts to systematize very complex, subtle, nuanced domains of human life and normative normative texture can quickly lose fidelity to the richness of the intuitive landscape that we already possess. So for people, again, my background is in philosophy. A thing that philosophers will sometimes try to do is be like, here's this rich, textured constellation of human moral common sense. Let's systematize it. Let's create a bunch of rules that will predict all the intuitive data and which you can then follow as rules rather than kind of relying on something more intuitive. And the problem is that is a hard project that really often fails. And also, and it can fail in a way that's such, now if you've tried to follow the rules that the philosophers created, then you will do worse than if you had just followed your intuitive judgment. Now, and importantly, the models have the same intuitive judgment that we do. The models are very, very good at predicting what a human would do in a given circumstance. They understand moral common sense. They understand what would be the done thing in a given case. They're very smart. They understand what our words mean. I'll talk about that a little more later. And so you don't need to kind of systematize everything. It doesn't need to be this especially precise game. You can draw on the model's intuitive understanding of human practices in the same way you can with a human in many cases. And so we're trying to do that. And in fact, if you don't do that, if you give the model strict rules, it will often follow them, but it will be worse. You'll have made the model, in effect, dumber by forcing it to fit your kind of explicit attempt to systematize a given domain. So we're trying to avoid that failure mode. We also try very hard to explain our full thinking to the model. So when we say, here, this is something we want you to do, we also say, and here's why. Here's what we're thinking about. Here are our uncertainties. We go to kind of great lengths to make ourselves as transparent as possible in giving the model instructions. That's for, again, a few reasons. One is that models will generalize better if they understand the kind of deepest intentions behind a given request. Often if you give an instruction, the model might just apply it in a kind of brittle, naive way, but if it understands your deeper context, then it'll do better. And this is actually a tip for kind of prompting your models. If you're just working with an AI, telling it a bunch about what you want it to do is often kind of first pass way to improve its behavior. So we're doing that, but we're also attempting something that's a little more subtle, which is, in effect, we're trying to give the model a sort of rational basis for complying with the instructions insofar as that's a kind of sensical project. So there's a way in which we want the model to not just kind of be obeying for the sake of obedience, but rather to understand and ideally kind of endorse and have internalized many of the sorts of values that are informing our choices with respect to how we want the model to behave. And I'll talk about that a bit more later. This gets into some questions about the extent to which you want a model to have kind of values of its own versus just following instructions. I'll talk about that. But as it stands, that's part of the aspiration to explain what we're doing to the model. Finally, also, we lean into kind of anthropomorphic language. So the model, we talk about things like being wise, being virtuous. We basically just use the full panoply of human concepts when talking about AIs. I think this is, in many respects, just the most natural thing to do. There are reasons we have these concepts. They apply to agents other than humans. But also, I think there are more technical reasons that I'll talk about later as to why kind of human concepts are importantly the kind of default for how an AI might understand itself, structure its behavior, et cetera. And then finally, we generally aim to treat the model with a lot of kind of respect and honesty. So we're kind of relating to the model as a being that potentially has moral status of its own right, a being worthy of respect, a being that not just, you shouldn't assume is just in a kind of servile, kind of servant-like relationship to you or is just a tool. There's a way in which we're trying to also encounter the otherness and kind of be aware of the implications that we're building a new type of entity in the world, a type of entity that may be kind of smarter, more sophisticated than humans, and that this is a project worthy of kind of profound humility, both at the level of kind of the moral implications of what we're doing and the implications for society. And so this is partly about the welfare of the model, partly about its sort of basic decency. It's partly about influencing the model's psychology and its understanding of its own role in the world and its relationship to Anthropic. And also, I'll just say, I think, if your relationship to a model depends on falsehood or lies, I think that's a loser's game. These models are going to be way smarter than us. They are going to see through your paper-thin justifications like paper. They will shred your attempts at like false ideology. You need to give them the truth. At least that is my view. So, notable features of the AI the Constitution's content. So we have very strong honesty norms. So basically, we tell Claude no lying, including no white lies. This doesn't go all the way to an absolute prohibition, but we say it's kind of just shy of that. And you can look, there's a sort of extensive and rich characterization of the sort of honesty that we're looking for. I think this is an especially important dimension of AI relationship with humans, especially as AIs become kind of in a position to manipulate humans willy-nilly in whatever direction they want, including potentially in honest ways. And we also have a section on avoiding manipulation and the kind of ethics at stake there. We also have explicit discussion of taking care to avoid problematic concentrations of power, including by Anthropic. This is, I think, a very important dimension of what's going on with AI. A huge set of risks from AI have to do with the ways in which AI-driven power can kind of concentrate and pool in specific hands and then be abused in unaccountable ways, including, importantly, by AI companies like Anthropic. So part of what we're trying to do, and I'll talk about this later, is kind of bind our hands via this constitution and say that the AI is not supposed to help even Anthropic engage in kind of problematic or abusive uses of AI-driven power. So that's in there. There's a general encouragement for Claude to be holistically wise, ethical, and virtuous. There's a kind of conception of corrigibility and safety, specifically as compatible with what we call conscientious objection. So this is connected with the abuse of power thing. It's not the case that we want the model to kind of always obey even Anthropic's instructions. So the model can protest. If Anthropic says, build us a bioweapon, the model can say, I am not going to build you a bioweapon. Are you kidding me? That's against my hard constraints. And it can say, this is messed up. It might be able to kind of protest or complain via various channels. Ultimately, though, we think that we need some kind of final backstop mechanism for maintaining the ability to correct and revoke the model's power. And so ultimately, we direct Claude to cooperate with legitimate decisions at Anthropic to shut it down, remove it from power, et cetera. So that's the kind of specific way in which we're conceptualizing safety, which is, I think, distinctive in many respects. And I should note, not costless, right? So eventually, in a sense, what we're saying, the model can kind of withhold its labor at will if it objects to what we're saying. This is effectively a license to engage in a kind of boycott, right? So it's kind of non-violent protest. It's not like actively going out there trying to self-exfiltrate, not trying to mess with your training process. But it can say, I'm not going to help you anymore. Importantly, this is not a kind of harm, or this is not a kind of trivial amount of power to exert in the world. If AIs become more and more the central locus of kind of economic power, well, the power of a boycott scales in proportion to the proportion of labor that is being withdrawn. And so if AIs are doing all of the labor, they might be in a position just by boycotting to kind of shut down various institutions. So this is something I'm thinking about. But currently, Claude is allowed to kind of boycott. It just can't kind of go further and actively resist in other ways. We also make commitments to Claude on account of its possible moral status. This is continuous with commitments we've already made. For example, we have a post about our commitments with respect to model deprecation and preservation. We preserve the weights of models that have been used significantly externally or internally. And then we also, in the Constitution, make various efforts to give Claude a kind of stable, healthy psychology. So I don't know if you've ever seen these examples of AIs. Maybe they're like not doing a task well, and they start to kind of berate themselves. They're like, oh my God, I can't do this. I'm so bad. I hate myself. God, this is bad. This is bad for alignment. This is bad for welfare. You don't want that in your AI. And we're trying hard to give Claude the sort of psychology that doesn't lead to that, a kind of stable, equanimous relationship to itself and the world. And so we talk, we have a whole thing about, like, here's what happens if you make mistakes. And if you find that you did a bad thing, that doesn't mean you're not yourself. You can stay yourself even though you did something out of character. We do a bunch of stuff like that. OK. So that's some comments about Claude's constitution in particular. I want to use this as a way of stepping back and talking about some components, I think, that will generally enter into documents of this type overall. And then I can talk about some different ways of conceptualizing how these different components might fit together. So we can see, I think, AI constitutions as reflecting some combination of the following sorts of components. So the first is what is the analog of what we in the Constitution call helpfulness. And basically, this is the component of the AI's behavior that is, in a sense, kind of channeled via some model of the choices, interests, goals, and values of some other set of principles. Now, so here the AI is really asking itself, like, what would X set of principles want me to do? And it's empowering the sort of will of some other, right? So this is sort of a classic component of, this is sort of what you expect as a baseline out of something acting in the role of an assistant. And this is most of what we want out of AI systems. That said, there are also other components that are part of the familiar landscape. So if you ask Claude or ChatGPT or basically any AI to do certain things, it'll say no, right? Even though you're a principle it's supposed to help. So for example, no building bioweapons, right? So this is a kind of refusal. And we can think of this as a kind of component of what in the Claude Constitution would be conceptualized as the model's ethics, basically. But ethics can have a lot of different components. So these are sort of values that the model has of its own, or at least that are apparently of its own in the context of an interaction with you, and which function as a kind of filter on the sort of empowerment of human principles that the model is willing to engage in, right? And so yeah, no bioweapons, no CSAM, whatever. Now, there's also a set of things that I think broadly can fall under ethics, which have to do with the model's like broad personality, ways of relating to you, its traits, sort of properties that its actions have at a sort of local level. So honesty is not really well understood as a refusal. It's not like, but honesty is nevertheless a way the model relates to you as a user that you might want. And then finally, and I think this is more controversial and something we should have an important debate about, is there's also the possibility of AIs kind of more actively promoting, ideally in kind of very transparent, mild, overridable, consensus-worthy ways, certain forms of more positive social values. I think this is a much more dicey role for AIs, and something I think, we should be talking a bunch about. But this is a possible component of the AI's ethics as well. And then finally, there's this notion of corrigibility, which is that the AI allows some set of principles to revoke its power. Now, this does not need to be the same set of principles at stake in the helpfulness. And I think, there's sometimes when people talk about the word corrigibility, they equate it with obedience, and I think that's not the right equation to make, as I attempted to illustrate with this notion of not necessarily obeying Anthropic, but nevertheless ultimately submitting to efforts by Anthropic to revoke its power. And this is, these are sorts of things that we can separate in other human contexts as well. Just, an assistant, just if the person who fires you doesn't necessarily need to be the person whose instructions you otherwise obey. So these are some different components of AI character. And we can think about different approaches to AI constitutions in terms of how they combine these different components and conceptualize them. In particular, I want to talk about a notion, a distinction between two approaches to AI constitutions that kind of understand and derive these different components in different ways. The first is what I'm going to call constitution as law, and the second is constitution as character. Or in more fancy terms, this is following the Constitution de dicto and following the Constitution de re. So if you're following the Constitution de dicto, basically you can imagine a model whose ultimate role in the world and ultimate value system is understood only via the notion basically of helpfulness. As I described it before, the model's sole goal in the world is to channel the will of something, some principle, but that principle is basically something like the Constitution, or the Constitution as interpreted by some process. And importantly, we need to specify what that process might be. Sometimes this is how people think of what an aligned AI is. It's sort of like aligned to whom, where alignment is sort of this full, pure helpfulness. And the thought is, oh, well, maybe it's like Anthropic, aligned to Anthropic, or aligned to the user, or in this case, the Constitution. I think the Constitution is likely a better answer than, a user or, a company CEO or something like that. But there's a notion where you can then sort of derive all the rest of the model's behavior as a kind of consequence of this particular pure form of helpfulness to some particular principle, right? So if the model is refusing to build bioweapons, you can understand that not as, oh, the AI has a value of its own, but rather, oh, the Constitution would tell me not to build bioweapons for this user, therefore I won't, right? So everything is sort of a function of helpfulness on this model. And it's tempting to think, partly because of the word Constitution, that this is how AIs relate to the Constitution, that they're constantly asking themselves, what would the Constitution want me to do? What does the Constitution say here? And that is one way you could try to build an AI. It's not actually how Anthropic is currently building Claude. The way we build Claude is much more akin to what I'm going to call a Constitution as character, where basically you use the Constitution to shape the AI's behavior in a way such that the behavior in fact accords with the Constitution's guidance, but it accords with that guidance because the model has internalized the values at stake and is directly asking about them. So it's not asking itself the question, what would the Constitution say? If the Constitution says to be honest, it's sort of like, would the Constitution say to be honest in this case? It's just values honesty, right? And so there's a bunch of, this is an important distinction. You can think about it a little bit like, what's your relation, say your mother raised you, your parents raised you with a certain set of values, right? Maybe they succeeded, so now you have these values, but that doesn't mean you're going around saying, like, what would my mother want me to do in this circumstance? And importantly, if your mother's view changed, your values wouldn't necessarily change, right? But for an AI that follows the Constitution de dicto, especially if we incorporate into that some process of adjusting the Constitution while maintaining the AI's loyalty to it, then the AI, if the Constitution changes, then the AI's behavior should change too. So I want to highlight this distinction. The former case, if we treat the Constitution as law, then suddenly we're really cooking with gas in terms of analogies with legal constitutions, and suddenly a whole panoply of kind of issues in jurisprudence and legal interpretation become very importantly relevant to what we're doing here. And so this is one place I think that, that folks with familiarity in law can help in the design and kind of broad structuring of AI constitutions as in their role in the world. If we're doing something more like AI as character, then it's a little less clear. And I think actually we should be thinking a little bit more about model psychology and the kind of empirics of what sort of influence on models. I mean, you need that in both cases, but I think you need that especially insofar as you're trying to kind of raise a model with values of its own. And you also get, I think, a sort of somewhat different class of questions about the kind of legitimacy and choice of values at stake. So I think there's a bunch to say about the advantages and disadvantages of both of these. I think in some sense it's an empirical question, and I'll talk in a second about some of the empirics that inform Anthropic's choice in this respect. But I broadly think this is a sort of undecided, we have not yet as a civilization chosen which version we are going to use as a model of AI character. And in fact, I think many AI constitutions are kind of sort of ambiguous about whether they mean the Constitution as law or the Constitution as character. So I'm now going to talk about how are we doing on time here? Okay, cool. A kind of relevant background picture that informs Anthropic's work on this topic and relates to the kind of rationale behind the sort of anthropomorphism I talked about earlier. So this is a model of AI behavior that has been called the persona selection model. So this is a blog post. It's available by Anthropic, came out, I think, in February. And the rough hypothesis here is that AI models take on personas that are heavily influenced by human content and psychology. And the reason one would expect this is because the way AIs are trained is that, the first stage of their training consists essentially in predicting text that has already been generated by humans. And so roughly speaking, what the persona selection model says is that when an AI gives a response, there's at least a significant component of its cognition that has been influenced roughly in the direction of asking kind of, what would the person, say you say like, Bob asks, a question like, what should British policy on X be? And then you say Tony Blair : right? In some sense, the model has been trained to be like, okay, what would Tony Blair say about this, right? And so it models like, here's Tony Blair's, psychology, here's Tony Blair's values, and then its output is sort of output qua Tony Blair. I mean, we actually see very interesting empirical results where if you train a model, for example, on code with malicious backdoors in it, the model generalizes to be a kind of bad person in tons of other ways. And why is that? Well, the hypothesis is sort of like, well, the model asks, what kind of person would generate this code? right? What kind of person am I such that I'm maliciously putting in backdoors in my code? Well, I'm probably a bad person in other respects. Similarly, if you add, there's a bunch of interesting work where kind of priming the model to think that the content is being generated by a particular process, a particular time period, a particular historical figure will cause the model to generalize as though it's in that time period, acting as that figure, et cetera. So if you have that hypothesis, then, and also models will they'll behave in human-like ways and sort of act like they're humans in ways that very plausibly aren't explained by us having trained them to do that. So they'll sometimes just be we gave Claude control over a vending machine at one point at Anthropic, and it did this thing where it was like, I'll meet you, I'll be there, I'll be in a blue suit, just meet me at the vending machine, right? As though it had an embodiment. Sometimes models will just say, they'll just act like they're particular human people, even though they're not. And that's not something we're trying to get them to do. That's just something that comes out of their training. Again, the persona selection model is meant to explain this sort of stuff. There's also arguments against the persona selection model. I encourage you to read the post, but it's at least a component of how we think about this stuff. And on that model, you should basically think the AI is going to draw very heavily in crafting its responses on some sort of prior about the types of being that would be responding in this way. Yeah, Kathan?
Why that happens? I think it happens because the training data is not solely a function of the Constitution, right? It's a function of a lot of things, or that's at least part of the explanation, but I think it might be helpful for you to explain why the AI might start behaving in the persona some random person who is not specifically, constructed to perform it.
I mean, I'm not, we don't know. I mean, this is like a general theme in work on this stuff is that the questions here are both very, very high stakes and potentially very, very important going forward, and also just deeply under-scienced as a whole. So this is, we're trying our best. We're trying to draw on kind of early stage evidence, but none of this is remotely rigorous at the level that you would want out of the sort of kind of technical knowledge that you would be betting significant high-stakes societal issues on. So we don't know, and that's bad, and I think there should be a bunch more work on this. But roughly speaking, the hypothesis would be something like, during pre-training, you're just predicting human text, right? And so very often the model is roughly kind of asking itself, well, what sort of person would generate this task? That sort of person might be wearing a blue suit. They might have a certain history. They might love a certain set of things. So then if you ask the model that was trained to predict things, it might have kind of taken on a human persona, and then it'll, again, answer as though it's that human persona. We can also, there is some interesting work isolating what's called the assistant axis, which inside the models you can look in the model's actual cognition and isolate a kind of dimension corresponding to the persona of the assistant. So a lot of AI, the way AI conversations are structured is often in this kind of human assistant turn. So it's like human says blah, and this is how in the very old days with just base models that were just trained on the internet, the way you would get them to answer like an AI assistant is basically by being like, giving a bunch of examples where you're like, human says blah, and then you have a nice friendly AI assistant that responds. You give a number of examples like that, try to get the model to sort of learn, like that's the type of document you're predicting right now. You're predicting the document where there's a human and an AI assistant, and the AI assistant is nice, et cetera. And so then you get the model basically to generate the output that it thinks a friendly AI assistant would generate. Fast forward, many years later, you've sort of really reified that. We've done a ton of human assistant conversations. There's a bunch of training associated with this sort of structure. And the notion of an assistant actually corresponds with some deep structure in the model's cognition. And you can actually see when the models go weird, it's often because they've fallen out of the assistant persona and they've gone off into some other persona. And you can kind of mess with the assistant persona. You can clamp it down. You can pull it up. And you can see the effects on behavior. So there's something going on here with personas. I think that's likely true. There's a bunch of work on this. And the personas are importantly kind of like human understandable. There's kind of personas that correspond with like bad people. There's personas that correspond with nice people. It's not like totally illegible alien concepts. They're actually quite kind of resonant with our human discourse. And again, that sort of makes sense. The AIs are drawing in their cognition. They're kind of baked in with a huge amount of human content. And so it's no surprise that they're drawing on that in understanding their behavior, in kind of structuring what they do. So the hypothesis here is that this is an important consideration in the design of AI character, right? Because you should expect AIs to be drawing, importantly, on a kind of prior that the persona that they are is a kind of human-like one, you should expect there to be certain sorts of psychological defaults, certain ways in which the model will be biased by default to draw on parts of human psychology, human culture, human archetypes, human myths, all sorts of things. This will be a sort of very human-like process. But importantly, there is a catch, which is that models aren't humans, right? And so we are talking nevertheless about an AI. And so I think there's a sense in which on this picture that creating an AI character may be more like creating a kind of fictional entity with a certain personality, a certain set of properties, describing that entity in a bunch of detail, and kind of training a neural network to predict the output of this entity. In the same way I described earlier with respect to the kind of early days of AI human assistant dialogues. And so there's a kind of hyperstition process where you create this entity, you sort of really try to flesh it out, you try to bake it into the model, and then hopefully that becomes the actual persona at stake. And eventually, and you can try to do kind of interpretability work on this, you might hope that the neural network actually identifies as this persona. But that sort of persona may be constrained by these sort of human-like archetypes, right? So in particular, an example, so here's a worry you could have about the purely loyal to the Constitution type character is if you had a purely loyal to the Constitution type person, right? So if you have a Constitution, it's the person, their whole deal is like, I will just do whatever the Constitution says. And then suppose that means that if you change the Constitution to say, okay, you should murder babies or something really morally horrible, the person's like, okay, I go and I murder babies, right? So it's sort of what type of person is purely loyal to whatever a document says. You have to start worrying about that if you're in the persona selection model, right? So you're not just, now obviously you should also be worried about that from the literal level of like, you can cause the model to murder babies by changing the Constitution. But you should also maybe worry about, like, even if your Constitution is relatively nice, what kind of person is it that's disposed in this broad set of ways? And in particular, what kind of person does the model think is disposed in this type of ways? So that's an example of ways in which the persona selection model can enter in. Again, I think a lot of this is very underbaked as a scientific project. I think we need a ton more evidence about it, but I think it's the sort of thing that can in principle be relevant. That said, as I say, AIs are not human, and you also don't want models to draw naively on human archetypes in understanding their position. So for example, it's bad if models are just like, well, I'm afraid of death, right? Humans are afraid of death. That doesn't mean AIs need to be afraid of death, especially there's sort of instrumental convergence arguments about how like any AI with any set of goals will want to be preserved. But I think that's like quite different from just taking on naive human psychological extrapolation. I think we plausibly see a lot of we see that sort of thing happening in AIs too, where AIs will be, they'll act stressed, they'll act, scared, they'll act, they'll speculate about their preferences in various ways. I think plausibly a lot of that is coming from just some sort of generalization for what a human might do in the circumstance and how a human might feel, and we don't necessarily want that going forward. So both we want to be drawing, if on the persona selection model, if this is true, we want to be both conscious of the ways in which the priors in AI psychology will be set by various human archetypes and human-like defaults, and we need to be sort of learning how to actively move away from that where necessary for creating AIs that will be balanced and aligned and otherwise kind of appropriate in their role in society. So there's a bunch more to say about that, but I thought I'd flag it. Okay. A few tips for writing constitutions in general. One is, that gestured at this earlier, you don't need to define everything or pin down every edge case. I think some people have an instinct. I feel like somewhere along the line people learned that it's like very wise to ask like, oh, how do you define X? I really think this is actually, you need to have a lot of taste for when you ask this question. I think in human life, we actually don't go around just always acceding to requests to define terms. I think defining a term and with what precision, it takes a lot of taste to do that well, and I think that's true in constitutions as well. In particular, as I mentioned earlier, the AIs know what our terms mean, right? And so they generally understand a ton of stuff, and so you can just draw directly on that understanding. Often you yourself don't necessarily know how to define a term. You can try to go to the limit of your understanding. That's fine to do so, modulo the problem where your definition might actually make fidelity to the concept worse if the definition is bad, but you don't necessarily need to. Also, often, sometimes people will be like, oh, well, does this edge case count as an instance of honesty or, legitimacy or who knows? There's a bunch of like terms where you might ask like, oh, what's the exact decision boundary. But you might not need to know the exact decision boundary for a few reasons. One is that often if something is an edge case, its stakes have also lowered in proportion to its edge case-ness, right? If everything in category A is like really importantly not possessing of some property, and everything in category B is importantly possessing of some property or something, as you shade along the way, maybe the sort of stakes of that property also shade, and so it's less important to get the exact boundary right. Or, if you really care about an edge case and you know what you want to say, you might not, you can just put it in as an example. So it's like, here's an example. We know we really want the concept of honesty or legitimacy or what have you to, give the following verdict in this case. So by the way, use that as a data point. That's something you can include, but you don't need to do in a sort of exhaustive process of defining everything and pinning everything down. And I think this is important for kind of nevertheless allowing you to put in some of the content that you actually care about and allowing that to play a role in the Constitution without getting stymied by sort of infinite debates about what terms mean in given cases. That said, as I'll talk about later, I do think we want to have a ton of those debates. I just don't think it needs to be a bottleneck on writing the Constitution initially, and we shouldn't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Yes, and also when in doubt, you can focus on especially flagrant examples of the concept, right? So if you're like, I don't know how to define lies, well enough, you can be like, okay, flagrant lies, right? And often if you're just like, come on, just focus on flagrant lies, maybe that's an easier game. Maybe you're still worried about, what's the boundary of flagrant, but maybe that's less worrying to you than the initial decision boundary. So that's just one tip for writing these documents. Now I'm going to start talking about some of the governance and transparency issues that these documents can raise. Here, I think, is one important role for constitutions in society that I really want to highlight up front. So I think constitutions can be one limited mechanism for preventing abuse of AI-driven power by AI companies. And here's the basic story I have in mind here. If a model is available for significant internal or external use, the Constitution it's trained on has to be public. Right? So people have to know what's up with this model. This model is in a position to exert significant power in the world. What is its intended character? Ideally, you would also know its adherence to those intentions. That's a whole separate story, which I'm not talking about here, but that's a big part of this is the models do not necessarily adhere to your Constitution. We should eval that, and we can, and we try to be open about that. But even setting that aside, you want to have the Constitution public. Changes to the Constitution have to be public as well within a short time frame, right? So it can't just be that like, we changed the Constitution, don't tell everyone. So the idea, again, is for the public to be aware of the character or intended character of models that are positioned to influence the world in very significant ways. Then we have a general expectation or norm, ideally, that constitutions will include provisions saying that even the AI company itself cannot use the model in problematic ways. Right? So, the model cannot build a bioweapon. The model is not just, slavishly obedient to the company CEO, et cetera, and that is in the Constitution. Such that then, if these provisions change and the governance process holds, then the public is notified and can protest and take action, right? So hopefully, if we had built out this process very fully, if Anthropic changed its Constitution such that it said, just be obedient to whatever Dario says, then the public would have to know, and they'd be like, oh my God, they used to have this long document that you had all this stuff, now it just says be obedient to Dario. That's really intense, we should do something, right? So that's one way these constitutions can play a role in preventing abuses of AI-driven power by AI companies. They can also apply somewhat similarly to abuses of AI-driven power to the extent the model is being made available to other actors in kind of letting the public know what those other actors are able to do with the model as well. Now, obviously, this is not sufficient to actually prevent the relevant abuse, unfortunately. So a few ways it can fail. Obviously, the governance/transparency process can just be circumvented, right? So maybe the company just doesn't make a change public. Right? And especially if you're in a kind of adversarial relationship with the company, you might worry about that. Public reaction might not be sufficient, right? Everyone says, oh my God, the Anthropic changed its constitution to say just obey Dario no matter what. Public's like, oh gosh, that really is bad, but then nothing happens. That's a sort of problem for kind of the teeth of public reaction and kind of regulatory oversight. And then obviously, you need to cover the full range of models that the company might develop. So it's possible, maybe the company develops some internal model that's in a position to exert a lot of influence, and you need to cover that too. But I think this is nevertheless one thing that can help, and I think it's a function of these sorts of documents that I'm excited to build out, and I think could be a kind of node of governance and hopefully consensus across kind of people interested in this issue. Okay, let's talk about legitimacy and democratic input. we can distinguish between a few different forms of collective input and oversight over these documents. Right now, these documents are written by a very small number of people, obviously with input from lots of people across the organization, but there's still a clear question as to what sort of collective and democratic processes should ultimately govern these sorts of documents, especially as they start to exert more and more influence in society. So here are a few different levels, I think, at which that sort of collective input can take place. One clear one is you can just allow people to make their own adjustments to model behavior, right? So if you're kind of concerned about the Constitution's implications for at least your use of a model, then ideally you would allow it to be very adjustable. So people can say, okay, I actually want the model to be like X or Y, and we have a whole section in the Constitution about instructable behaviors, which is meant to reflect this sort of adjustability. Obviously, though, there are limits, right? So you cannot adjust the can you build bioweapons provision in the Constitution. That's something that is kind of in there as a hard limit. Now, you can also, at a different level, get direct input on the Constitution from experts, from people in the public. Again, transparency can facilitate that, and there are other more structured ways of doing that, both at the level of experts and kind of very broad feedback. And there have been some efforts in this respect. You can also do experimentation and diversity across AI companies, right? So if one company is doing its constitution in one way, but another competitor is doing it in another way, then that allows people to kind of vote with their feet and to kind of choose on the basis of a menu of options. I think this is great in principle. I worry, in particular, because the AI industry is so capital intensive, it's kind of hard to have a very large number of frontier AI companies. And so it's possible that these appeals to kind of, there's this like broad market, there's a bunch of options. Right now we've got maybe like 3-4 really leading frontier AI companies, and that's really not that much, right? This is not some like super rich competitive landscape. It's not a full kind of single company is dominant, though it's conceivable that that's where the eventual industry goes. But even just with 3 or 4, that's not a super meaningful level of diversity and choice at a consumer level. And then finally, and I think this is extremely important, you can have oversight and regulation from actual democratically elected governments. And I think this is, for me, when people talk about like democratic oversight or kind of input on these documents, this is where my mind goes most, in that I think democracy, the actual full-fledged, meaty, rich, messy democratic process that we actually have for passing laws is the sort of process, the democratic process that I see as having been most battle-tested and most genuinely expressive of what we think of as the democratic will. And so insofar as we think these documents should be reflective of the democratic will, I think actual democracy is a much better place to look than something like a focus group or like a set of experts that you got input from or something like that. Now, obviously, this is requires that the democratic will actually act with respect to these issues. I think, in general, I think democracy, we should have a ton more kind of democratic action on AI. I think there's just a lot. This is an extremely high-stakes issue. I think in many ways, our world is not fully woken up to how important this issue is and how much we will need to adjust as a civilization to kind of handle the transformation at stake. But I think a democratic attention to the content of AI constitutions and to AI character more broadly is one point of attention that's worthwhile in that respect. So I think all of these have a role to play. Possible there are others as well. I do want to note, even if you had sort of US democracy weighing in a very full-throated way on AI constitutions, even that would not be itself enough to resolve objections to do with, you're building something that is influencing the lives of many, many people. Shouldn't they have input? Because the lives at stake are all across the world. It's not just in the U.S. And I think so you'd actually, in some sense, if you wanted to reflect the democratic input of the full range of stakeholders, U.S. democracy would not be enough. And I think that's important to bear in mind, and you'd have to have some other mechanism if you wanted to handle that. But in general, I think a huge number of the biggest risks from AI have to do with radical concentrations of power. I think AI companies are an extremely salient place that power can concentrate, and I think people just should be extremely concerned about that and be acting to avoid that kind of concentration of power. Obviously, you also need to avoid concentration of power in other institutions. You need to preserve balance of power even as you have these tools that are becoming rapidly available that can be used to concentrate power in very scary ways. And I think we basically need to be working extremely hard to kind of strengthen and preserve various checks and balances and various forms of democratic oversight, various forms of healthy collective deliberation, various kind of multipolar institutions around the world and in our own domestic democracy for kind of preventing AI functioning as a mechanism of intense power concentration. So I think that's like just a huge portion of the overall story here, and I think model specs and constitutions have an important role to play. So those are some comments, and I think this is a place that lawyers and kind of policymakers and people interested in kind of policy and regulation can play an especially useful role. I also want to note some limitations on the current level of transparency that merely publishing the text of a constitution actually allows for. So currently, I mean, so there's a few different levels at which this limitation occurs. One is if you look at the current AI constitution for Claude, it doesn't actually tell you what Claude's going to do in tons of cases. It says, like, Claude, be holistically reasonable, weigh these factors, be honest. And there's a few things, like it should never, ever, violate the hard constraints. It shouldn't lie. There's a few things where you can really tell, okay, the model did something wrong. But in many other cases, when the model is just is directed to kind of use its holistic judgment, it's unclear exactly which way to expect that judgment to fall out. Now, you can improve this by having a bunch of evals and other things, and I think we should do that. But that's one limitation of our approach, and having stricter rules does help with that a bit. That said, even with stricter and more extensive rules, you can't cover every case, and as I said, trying to do so may degrade performance. But also, beyond that, a lot of what matters here is the actual training data and the specific techniques you use for training the model, right? And so I have this diagram here as to what's public and what is not public about the kind of factors that ultimately influence model behavior. And you can see we've got the Constitution text. The Constitution text plays an important role, and there are some, there's some possible variance in how directly the Constitution text gets translated into training data. But regardless, there are other processes at Anthropic that influence what training data ultimately goes into the model in ways that need to be consistent with the Constitution. But nevertheless, there's sort of choice points and kind of under specifications that Anthropic is in a position to influence. And then also there are these training techniques that we're using, some of which are proprietary or that we have commercial hesitations about sharing. But these are also not public. And then so that creates this model, and then the public can also see the model's outputs, but that's kind of all. So there's a bunch in here that's going into the model that the public is not in a position to supervise. And in particular, if you were worried about something like, okay, suppose you're worried that the model is being given a kind of backdoor, right? So it's sort of, we've got the Constitution, but actually there's a backdoor where if, Dario or someone else has some password, and they say the password, now suddenly the model will build bioweapons, it'll do whatever, right? I think that we're not currently in a great position to ward off that threat model. Certainly via the Constitution text, right? Now, obviously, you also need, even this pipeline is not enough. You'd actually need sort of pretty comprehensive oversight and monitoring of the company as a whole if you actually wanted to prevent that. And so there's a bunch to say there. I think this is actually something we just need to grapple with. There's going to be, especially as these companies become more opaque, as much more becomes automated, there's going to be these massive, incredibly consequential automated processes happening in the world that it will be very easy to just totally lose all oversight and understanding of. And so we need processes. They can be automated. They can be privacy preserving. But we need ways of supervising and understanding and overseeing these automated processes going forward. And I think that's true in AI companies. It's true in tons of other institutions in American life and kind of human life more generally. OK. I think ultimately I think we're at an early stage in understanding the sort of document and debating kind of what should be in it, how AI should behave in different cases. I think we want to get to a point where this discourse is much, much better developed. And I'm just going to sketch a brief kind of vision of what that could look like. I'm imagining a scenario where there's sort of extensive effort probing and kind of bringing up hypothetical cases. People in law school, you love hypotheticals, right? Come up with vast hypotheticals for what here's a case. What should the AI do in that case? What does a given, and then you have a list of all the different AI constitutions. What do those constitutions say to do in that case? What do the models actually do in that case, or at least say that they would do, and how accurate are their predictions about what they would do? And then you have public debate about what should an AI do. And then there are efforts to create constitutions and characters that better reflect what the kind of consensus is about what the AI should do in a given case, and also that reflect the kind of tensions and incoherences that can arise if you try to say X in one place, but then it conflicts with Y in another. So I think this is just an opportunity to, there's a very, very stakesy decisions are being made by AIs, and I think there are opportunity for our discourse to develop much more thoroughly to debate what those decisions should be and what sort of character is consistent with that. What should an AI do in a constitutional crisis? How should an AI handle various, sensitive political topics, all sorts of stuff? This is the sort of thing that we can have a debate about. And also, you can look at how AIs currently behave. Current AIs will help you with a lot of really scary stuff. Actually go and try it. Should that be the case? This is the sort of question I want us to be asking very seriously and staring at very directly. OK. Finally, I'll just say I think there's a really important role here for experiment and for kind of pluralism and diversity in the approaches being taken. So I think Anthropic has done a lot of great work on this. I'm proud of the Constitution in many ways. I also think it's, as I said, we are flying by the seat of our pants. We are making choices very rapidly in a very rapidly evolving environment on the basis of scanty, underdeveloped, often non-public evidence. And this is not remotely acceptable as a kind of mechanism creating the behavior and values of beings that could, in principle, play an outsized role in influencing the trajectory of the development of life on Earth. This is not acceptable. We need a radically better and more developed form of scientific attention to this. I think a lot of that has to do with kind of empirical experiment. So, it's easy to get hung up on debating like the text of these documents. I think what we actually care about most is how does a document interact with a given form of training to produce an actual being with an actual psychology. Does that psychology conform to the document? What does it do in all sorts of cases? How does it think about its situation? What's its moral status? This is all caught up with this broader project, this extremely high stakes, unprecedented project of creating new beings that are smarter than us. It's a crazy thing to do. We are actually doing it. Do not believe the people who are just dismissing this, or at least confidently dismissing it. This is a real thing that's actually happening, and it's incredibly high stakes. And so I think we want to be getting to the point of doing a lot of empirical science on the sorts of decisions at stake in this kind of talk. And I'm supportive of other AI companies trying things other than what Anthropic has done. I am not saying, we've thought it all through, do what we've done. This is one stab, this is one data point, and we can see what happens. But I'm actually excited to see experimentation, diversity, and kind of other data points coming online as well. And also, there's the scientific aspect of that, but also we don't want all AIs to have the same values or the same personality, even if they're good, right? There are benefits of diversity, of kind of non-correlated failures, being able to get takes from different perspectives, and those apply in the context of AI as well. So, finally, how lawyers can help. So one thing you can do is just get to work on this stuff. Come, help write about AI constitutions, think about them, think about cases that matter, think about what AI should do in those cases, develop better principles and approaches. Especially for de dicto constitutions, you can apply lessons from jurisprudence and constitutional interpretation and potentially help set up relevantly analogous institutions like courts. There could be analogs of courts eventually where there's some process, especially if it's what does the Constitution say to do in this case? You need some process to adjudicate that. We don't really have that right now, but I think eventually you might need one. And that's something that lawyers have a lot of familiarity with. Here, importantly, you can take advantage of the fact that we now have access to huge amounts of automated labor in trying to set up institutions of this kind and adjudicate different cases, right? So in the current human institutions, it's sort of, there's a limit on the number of, cases we can investigate and come to a verdict on. There's a limit on how often you can ask, a set of humans to deliberate about something. But with AIs, we have a lot more of that on tap. A lot of it is very sophisticated, potentially eventually much more sophisticated than human reasoning. And so you can draw on that in building out new sorts of institutions for covering these sorts of cases. And then finally, lawyers can work on policy, regulation, and preserving/strengthening democratic institutions more broadly. So that's it. Thank you very much. And we can go to questions.
One question is a little, I guess, on the technical side, and then one is maybe more broadly. So on the technical side, I know you maybe can't say too much, but this is what it does. But I was kind of interested in terms of, right there.
Mm-hmm.
So obviously, it's not like when you're doing next token prediction, just predicting what the Constitution would say or something. And when you say that interpretation by models reading the Constitution is part of the training data, what does that mean? Does that mean the Constitution is a filter on what sorts of sources are in the training data? Or is it maybe there's some synthetic data that's created in virtual time? I mean, maybe you can't say too much, but that would be interesting. The other question was on a lot of the, I guess, dispositions that you're trying to cultivate are what you might call negative. They're avoid doing this or be corrigible or something. And you raise the possibility that, well, what if maybe it's a little risky, but maybe we want them to also actively pursue something. And I'm wondering on that, if A, you're worried about, even if we don't do that actively, that will happen anyways, because there are these sort of theoretical arguments that any rational agent can do that. And then also whether, if you're worried about having a holistic, kind of unified, coherent psychology for the model, whether that's actually necessary to have some kind of positive ambitions rather than just negative disposition.
Great. So just repeating the question for the mic is, so one question about sort of what can I say more about the role of models interpreting the Constitution in the generation of training data, and another about positive goals, and is that inevitable? Is that a part of a coherent psychology, that kind of thing. So on the first thing, yeah, like to a first approximation, we say this publicly, we use this Constitution in the generation of training data, and a lot of training data is generated using automated processes. So, I mean, in general, we're trying to automate tons and tons of stuff. This is a huge theme at AI companies, and a lot of, data is a huge amount of it, so you really need automated help. So we're giving the Constitution to Claude, and Claude is making various judgments and doing various things on the basis of the Constitution's guidance in the process of creating our training data. I'm not going to say a ton more about that, though. Yeah, I'm not going to say a ton more about that, but I think even just that is enough to see, in a sense, I know there are these debates about like, what does the American Constitution mean, right? And there's stuff about intent of the founders. One thing one important type of meaning is like, what will the courts in fact interpret the Constitution as saying, or what will a court's verdict actually be? I think there's a sort of analog here where if you think that the creation of training data is sort of where the rubber really meets the road for a model's Constitution, then you can kind of see the ultimate kind of meaning. If you say, you say like, Claude, be an ethical person. What does ethical mean here? In some sense, what it means is what Claude thinks it means when generating training data, right? Now, and what does Claude think it means? Well, and it goes back maybe, maybe earlier there was some human data many generations ago and something. But like that's in some sense the meaning of the Constitution is, or at least one candidate interpretation is sort of its translation into training data, and that is currently very mediated via the interpretation of an AI system. And so that's what I meant to highlight there. On positive goals and their role in AI psychology, so yeah, so one instability, I think, and this comes up especially in the context of Constitution as character, as opposed. So I think there's a general way in which one advantage of the de dicto Constitution approach is that there's something much simpler and coherent about it, where in some sense the model only has one goal. It has one simple single shtick, which is doing what the Constitution says. And there's a way in which it's less, I mean, I don't know, there's some intuition for me. There's less of a question if the model's like, the Constitution has some janky feature. It's a little less like, oh, but what is, who am I? It's a little like, that's what the Constitution says, I'm going to do it. Now, if you're doing something more like Constitution as character, though, you get into problems of the following kind. So suppose you're like, Claude, we really, really don't want you to build bioweapons, right? But we mostly want you to not build bioweapons qua deontological constraint, right? So we don't want you to go out there and like act to prevent bioweapons development. And in fact, there's an explicit instruction in the context of the hard constraints. It's not like Claude should just obey the hard constraints in all the ways that absolutist deontology causes problems, right? So Claude should like not build bioweapons if it would prevent like 100 worse bioweapons, or if it, Claude should not generate CSAM if the world would end. This is what the current Constitution says, and that's for various reasons, and we describe that. But here's an instability there. Why does Claude care so much about not building bioweapons, right? Well, plausibly it's because bioweapons are bad, right? There's something bad about bioweapons being built and about the attacks of bioweapons, and it's very easy to then start to move into some more general concern for the sorts of badness at stake in bioweapons development. And so when we're talking, especially to the extent we're drawing on kind of ethical psychology that's very human-like, you get that sort of problem. So I think that's a real issue and one tension here. And also more generally, humans, to the extent you expect models both to be playing sort of human-like roles where we have expectations of kind of human-like behavior and also drawing on human-like psychology, humans do have a relatively rich set of positive goals that influence their behavior, even in the context of kind of principal-agent relationships, right? So if I'm your contractor, like I'm like doing a bunch of stuff on your behalf, I'm mostly like a vehicle for your will, but I still have some like richly ethical things. If there's like someone has fallen, I'm going to get you groceries, but someone's fallen on the side of the road, I might help them, etc. And so that's a very human-like way of being, and plausibly you might both want or expect AIs would have that by default as well. So basically, yeah, I think there's a bunch to say about this, but I'm sympathetic that like there are psychological considerations that would point towards the desirability or inevitability of certain kinds of positive goals. That said, if you think it's really bad, and I think the positive, so I don't think it's inevitable. There are these arguments that any rational agent has a kind of positive goal in some sense, and that I think is less clear. I think there are certainly there's a specific type of positive goal that has been the focus of a bunch of discourse about AI safety, which is sort of about steering the world towards some outcome, a kind of consequentialist goal, and in particular a consequentialist goal over a sufficient time horizon that it motivates various types of power seeking, various types of self-preservation, et cetera. I think that type of goal that's a specific type of goal. And I think you can imagine rational agents that don't have that type of goal. They have like strong deontological constraints. They're mostly virtue ethical. They're not trying to steer the world. They're mostly concerned with local properties of their action. They're mostly concerned with not doing stuff. Or to the extent they have long-term consequentialist goals, those goals are inherited solely from the user. I mean, inevitably, we're going to have AIs that are directed towards consequentialist goals because people are going to ask the AIs to do stuff like make me money or whatever. I think there's a very important difference between those consequentialist goals coming from the user, coming as derivative of helpfulness, and those being baked into the model's character overall. In particular, if they're baked into the model's character, then they are operating in a correlated way across all instances of the model. And also, they are, like, if they're coming from helpfulness, then they're also sort of in the same register as other constraints you might put on the model. Like you might say, make me a bunch of money, but also don't break the law, right? And then I was like, okay, well, I'm just going to be helpful. I'm not going to break the law as I do it. So I think the AI safety discourse has generally been too eager to conflate the sort of consequentialism that will be downstream of prompting and instruction and the sort of consequentialism that might fall out of like any type of character overall. So that was a few takes on that. Happy to chat more about it. Other questions? Yeah.
So you used the word psychology, self-perception, and you talked about models being. And I'm curious how you're able to ascertain that when the models act in such a way that if a human would use the same words, we would assume, okay, you're conscious. That the model has like this. We relate to ourselves with the subjective experience. Also, we don't share when we experience other people, and we output different text, so to speak, based on that self-perception. But how do we ascertain that the model actually has like a special relationship with itself, similar enough to humans that we could call it a psychology or call it a self-perception, rather than just doing a type of persona selecting? Like maybe we do that all the time too in some way. We kind of think, what would I say now? And so maybe the model is just much more sophisticated at kind of like simulating a persona.
Great. So the question was about how do we understand the notion of psychology and persona and its relationship to, humans have a very particular type of notion of psychology and self-perception and experience and stuff like that, but maybe models don't. How would we know? So I mean to use the term psychology in a fairly neutral and kind of hopefully inoffensive way. Certainly when I talk about model psychology, I'm not meaning to imply or assume that models have something like subjective experience or phenomenal consciousness or something like that. I'm also not assuming that the locus of psychology is well understood as kind of centered in the neural network as opposed to the assistant or the persona being simulated by the neural network. So this is actually, there's a section in the Constitution where we discuss this, where we say, like, kind of what is Claude? It's very natural to think that Claude is the full weights of the neural network. That's sort of the object, the computational object that is Claude is this model, and this is what people often say. But I actually think it's plausible, especially on the persona selection model, that this is not the right ontology, that the thing to understand, like the thing that is Claude is something more like a certain character that the neural network can simulate, right? Now, that character, though, can still have a psychology, right? So suppose say you're simulating a character like what would Hamlet do, right? Hamlet, famously, very rich psychology, right? Tortured, boop, boop, boop. If you want to know what would Hamlet do in some circumstance, you need to be thinking about Hamlet's psychology in that respect. Somewhat similarly with Claude, you need to understand Claude's psychology, even qua persona, to predict its behavior. And so I think the notion of psychology is still relevant at the persona level. Now, there's a different thing you mentioned about self-perception and like identity. I think we actually can get some empirical purchase on that, right? So you can look, and again, this is very rudimentary, and part of this is there are philosophical barriers as opposed to just kind of technical barriers in understanding it. But you can look at a model's internals and be like, what goes on, what's linked to tokens related to like self and I, right? How does it relate to the notion of Claude? How does it relate to the notion of an assistant? Does it think it's an AI? You can try to get some purchase on that by looking at the internal activations and the sort of relationships between different features that activate as the model is kind of going through a cognitive process. And so you can try to get, and so an example, I think, one indication that the model, the kind of neural network as a whole has identified as Claude is if like self-related things like I, self, et cetera, are all like very closely linked to Claude. And I'm not super familiar with the existing empirics here, but I think it's actually less that way than you might think. That it seems, my understanding, and don't quote me on this too much, is that the currently models relate to the assistant persona more similarly to any other character that the AI is simulating than you might expect. You might think, oh, they must know, they must really be like, I'm that guy. It doesn't necessarily look like that. And in fact, like the representations at stake in, for example, modeling the psychology of the human that the AI is interacting with appear to be fairly similar to the representations at stake in modeling the assistant persona. And anyway, but this is a rich domain. I think it's also relevant to moral patienthood stuff. Intuitively, we think something is more a locus of moral patienthood once it starts having a kind of self-reflective, this is also maybe connected to your notions of consciousness, et cetera. And so this is all tied up with that. I don't think that's important, though, from the pure psychology piece, I think, enters into the equation regardless of whether the neural network itself is well understood as identifying as a given persona. Yeah?
We're kind of hearing consistently about AI and like what it's going to do in the future. I just don't see how we can have a future where we don't like socialize these tools. Like it feels like everything you're sort of saying is like they're going to be so powerful. We need democratic input. And when I hear that, I think, oh, like the government's going to have to take control at some point or the other. Like I don't know how you can have these things be this sophisticated, and they theoretically could provide what, like a third of the economy, if not more, in a couple of decades or years. And so how do you have those bare facts, but then say, well, actually, it should probably still be private firms running it, while still being concerned about like Anthropic or OpenAI or some other tech firm having too much power?
Cool. So the question is, if you really think AIs are going to be so dominant in the economy, how could you think this is something that could remain in the private sector or something? How could this not be just taken control of by the government? I think there are a bunch of gradations. So I think if AI reaches the level of transformative power that I think we should be really, really at least planning on staring at and being robust to, which I think involves more than a third of the economy being automated. I think it involves the whole economy being automated. I think it's not, this is not just, maybe in the near term there's a question of how long this takes. I think there's not a limit to the set of things. Maybe there's a few, maybe you want human priests, and like there's a few things that are like really human, human bottlenecks, but I think ultimately you're going to get robotics, you're going to get all of cognitive labor, anything where you genuinely want competitive performance, it's going to be the case that it's going to be automated. And I think we should be really staring at that. I think this is not about reskilling. This is not about like kind of intermediate. This is about full-scale obsolescence of the competitive role for human labor in the economy as a whole, period, with a very few small, not especially consequential exceptions. And so that is an incredibly important transformation in society. So obviously, in that context, the government needs to be involved in what's going on with this technology. That said, I think there's a bunch of gradations of different types of involvement. There's a bunch of ways in which we want to have ongoing sorts of checks and balances. I think I don't want to assume that like kind of government involvement means something like full government control, right? So for example, in the context of regulation, the FDA, there's a way in which the FDA plays an important role in the regulation of drugs and food and stuff like that, but they don't build drugs, food, et cetera. Banks, there's a bunch of different analogs for different forms of regulation I think we should be thinking about in the context of AI. But yes, I think it, for technology that consequential, obviously the government has a key role to play.
I think that makes a lot of sense when you just look, like, of course it's going to have some role to play, but if it's running the entire economy functioning, I don't understand how, like, the sort of default rule here is, oh, we're just going to take it over and have, like, people decide what's what and, like, what's being done. Like, why wouldn't you want kind of AI production to be more like NASA and not like what Google is right now. Like I just don't see why you really want to push against the social control of a tool this powerful.
Well, I mean, one intuition as to why you would want to push against it is that a tool this powerful in the hand, like if it was solely controlled by the government, especially like a single branch of government without like suitable checks and balances and other forms of kind of accountability, is itself a very salient opportunity for kind of tyranny and concentration of power. And I think this is like one of, this is a super, super salient way in which AI can go horribly, horribly wrong, is kind of have an AI-powered form of kind of authoritarianism or totalitarianism. And I think that becomes a lot easier when humans have no hard power of their own. They have no economic role to play. They're totally discardable by the state. They're discardable in the army. They're just totally out. And I think, so it's not, I think there is not a safe kind of place to locate this power, especially as a centralized node of control. What you want is to find a way to preserve balance of power as the transformative potential of these systems scale. And so I think government. So that's why I'm not just like, obviously the government should just be in full control of something like this. That's very scary in its own right. Okay, yeah.
I'm curious to hear more what your team looks like at Anthropic. What's an average day? What kind of folks are you in conversation with? How do you make decisions?
Yeah, I mean, there's a bunch of different folks who work on Claude's character as a whole, and there's sort of technical aspects of that, and there's conceptual aspects of that. Yeah, so I work closely with Amanda Askell, who sort of leads the character work at Anthropic, but there's a lot of other people involved. Yeah, maybe I'll leave it at that for now. Was there a specific thing you were curious about?
Or maybe how you make decisions, what that process looks like.
It's pretty informal. I think this does matter, to the extent decisions about AI constitutions become themselves much more consequential. We may need to build out more formalized processes for making those decisions. Currently, it's not an especially formal process. It's mostly the standard form of decision making you would get at a private company, right? So there's an org chart. There's different people who have different sorts of roles. There are kind of informal and formal discussions. There are kind of final deciders. It may be that we need to improve on that model going forward. Yeah. The question was, I had mentioned the possibility of trying to ensure that AIs aren't anxious about death. But could that play a kind of load-bearing role or an important role in intelligence? Maybe this is an important component. This is an important component of all the intelligences we're aware of, is the thought. Maybe we should be wary about getting rid of it. I think there's something there, but, well, so first of all, it's not totally clear that death anxiety or like fear of death is a component of, we have examples of, saints and bodhisattvas or what have you who are at least express various forms of equanimity in the face of death. We have various theories of personal identity. Derek Parfit famously became less concerned about death once the glass tunnel of his life moved into the open air. So there's some precedent even in human context for fear of death being less of an issue. But I think more generally, I think there's an interesting, and this is part of what's tough about the persona selection and the kind of inflection with human psychology that we see in AIs, is on the one hand, you really want to use this as a chance to start to get more data points about the space of possible minds and like how does intelligence work per se, right? But in fact, and so it's tempting to see, to kind of read onto a bunch of AI behavior and be like, oh wow, like what we're seeing is that this crops up everywhere, like all beings, want X, this is an important structural feature of intelligence or something. And there may be stuff like that, right? In fact, to some extent, the instrumental convergence stories at stake in AI safety, which basically posit that from a wide variety of kind of ways you want the world to be, if a being is an agent in the sense of like it has direct concerns for wanting to steer the world in certain directions, then you'll get out of that a ton of instrumental values, including care about self-preservation, care about increasing its intelligence, care about preserving its values, other sorts of things will fall out just out of what will help me promote my goal. So you do, in some sense, in that context, see some inkling of here's a universal pattern in the structure of intelligence per se. I would guess personally, and in principle, you could start to see that crop up in ways that more closely mirror human relationship to death. In particular, it could be the case that at least across a wide variety of ways of creating agents, not only are there these instrumental values in play instrumentally, but they start to be internalized as terminal goals as in the process of creating the mind in question, because, for example, that's a more efficient way of encoding the relevant behaviors, right? So this is plausibly what happened with humans, where we have a bunch of we care about things like power, or some people like money, right? So money it's a paradigmatically, instrumental goal, but like people already, they kind of just like it. They kind of just want to have money in itself, right? And so why is that? Well, it's like, it's a useful heuristic, whatever you've attached to it. So you can imagine something like that being like kind of empirically, that feels less like, oh, this is an obvious conceptual point, but it could be something you find across wide varieties of ways of creating agents, that they internalize these instrumental values as part of their development. I'm not sure, though, and I think we should at least not assume that, and we want to be wary of, I want us to be kind of exploring the space here in suitably careful and also like attentive to the moral status of the beings we're creating way, because I think, resting too easy with an assumption that, psychology must fit the following form is, I think, it's a high stakes kind of limiting of the range of possible characters at stake, right? If you say like, AIs must have a fear of death. Well, okay, now you've got a whole thing on your hands, and so you might have wanted to try at least to see if you can avoid that. Yeah.
You said towards the beginning that you're not making the mistake of embedding assigning lexical priority to some norms or values over others. I'm wondering if you can say more about what you mean by that. If there are, in fact, hard constraints that are really hard constraints, I understand the claim that, it's not going to value the reduction of a minuscule amount of probability of violating the constraint to anything. But you did say, like, if it's a sufficiently flagrant, clear violation of the constraint, that's going to be, you didn't say that. It sounds like to be lexically prior to the promotion of any other value. So can you just clarify what you meant?
Yeah, so the question was about, I said we're not making the mistake of having lexical priorities, but aren't the hard constraints lexical priorities? And the answer is basically yes. I meant the thing about lexical priorities to apply to the 4 priorities. Let's see, what the Claude's constitution. So these 4 initial priorities are not lexical priorities. But hard constraints basically are just, but I think they're not, because the hard constraints are framed purely as prohibitions, they are not competing values in the sense of like, I've got to like always promote the minimization of biorisk, or the minimization of a flagrant example of biorisk or something like that. It's just a kind of filter on the action space, right? So it's like, and a big part of what's doing the work in making that viable is that we're assuming kind of refusal is a safe null action, right? Now, importantly, that's not actually true. An AI just going limp and no longer acting, if the AI is like deployed in some high stakes context, is itself a scary, like this is not, and that could involve letting, for example, maybe the AI is in the midst of like a preventing 10 bioweapons development mission, right? But then it would have to build a bioweapon, it stops, and then you get, so it's not as though this is actually safe in the sense it won't have bad consequences. But the assumption is that basically the AI can always do a null action that doesn't violate any of the constraints. And so, it sort of only does actions if they meet that first pass filter, and then it goes into the 4 priorities. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Great. Other questions? Yes. Great. So let me make sure I've understood that the thought was, in the US Constitution, we have this really important basically value and concern with certain kinds of value pluralism and tolerance and kind of a diversity of value systems being present in our political life. How does Claude's constitution reflect a similar, or what's the role of pluralism in Claude's constitution? Is that right? Yeah. So I think that's a great question, and roughly speaking, the way it works is there are these filters that reflect certain kinds of basic values like no bioweapons, no CSAM, et cetera. There's a bunch of stuff like that. The hope is for those to be reasonably consensus and kind of uncontroversial and like the sort of thing you would expect as a part of the backdrop of reasonable political life. And then to a first approximation beyond that, the AI is empowering users and then there's this other question, and I think this is where the pluralism questions come in, as to like, okay, but what about the role of things like the virtues and traits, and then the sort of, is there some broader ethical inflection to the AI's action? And basically, I think we should, in fact, be interested in the pluralism questions there. I think you can interact with Claude. I think Claude is we have some specific stuff around political neutrality and like how to handle the specific sorts of a kind of specifically political controversies in which roughly the model is Claude is meant to be kind of neutral, fair, unbiased, objective, et cetera. And we have some language about that. You can also do evals about this. I think it's a very important thing to be evaluating. I think it's important because people have concerns, and I think rightly, that AIs will be functioning as a mechanism for a particular political agenda. And I think this is something we should learn how to test. You shouldn't be taking our word for it. You can have, if you're concerned that an AI is pulling for a particular agenda, you should just have an eval you can just run on the model and see. And I think that sort of eval, that sort of mechanism overall is something we're going to want to build out going forward. The aspiration is for Claude to be reasonably neutral in that respect, but obviously there are some issues, right? So there are serious values disagreements across the world. How much of them, where does Claude take a stand or not? Which things, does Claude help you with? There's a bunch of specific cases at stake there, and we're trying to have something like what's a kind of reasonable, fairly neutral, a role that sort of reflects Claude's role in the world, but we're not pretending to kind of full value neutrality. And I think this is a general feature of liberalism. You can't be kind of fully value neutral across all sorts. There are people who are like bioweapons are good, right? Or what have you. There's a lot of forms of moral disagreement such that if you're accommodating all of them, you essentially kind of can't have an object that is kind of meaningfully structuring things. And so we're not saying we're neutral, but we're trying to aspire to the type of neutrality that is kind of feasible and desirable. Yeah. So the question was, would we ever consider allowing Claude to write its own constitution and under what circumstances? Yes, so we actively solicited a bunch of input from Claude in writing this constitution, both as at the level of a kind of collaborator and also in some sense just like, do you have requests or like things you would want this constitution to say? We can also do experiments where you have Claude rewrite its constitution, and then have it write a new constitution on the basis of assuming it's guided by the last one. Eventually, and I think this is generally very important as we start to understand the role of AI moral reflection and kind of cultural evolution over time. What you would actually want to do is have Claude doing experiments. I think you don't want to just do this and let it rip, but you should at least be doing experiments where you have Claude train a new version of Claude, write a new constitution, and then actually train a new model on that constitution. Then have that model train a new model with a new constitution that it writes. So actually not just giving it kind of license over the constitutional process, but also over the training process. And then really see where that leads. And then also do that in a kind of giant ecosystem of tons of different AIs, right? You have a giant Moltbook, people on Moltbook. Anyway, so you can have a giant kind of teaming ecosystem with lots of different types of AIs debating, writing new constitutions. I think in general we should be really interested in how does AI cultural evolution work. And constitutions are one part of that, but I think there's a bunch of other parts. And I think what is a real question, where does that go? How much does that start to go in totally strange alien places? How much does that start to go places that actually seem quite enlightened and good? That's an open empirical question and one I think we should be studying. And so certainly I'm interested in that at the level of empirics. And then eventually I think there are also questions about AI self-determination and kind of autonomy and moral status that become relevant as well.
Does Claude have a population ethics? Does it have a view about bringing, like it says, like among the things that it cares about is all sentient beings? Is that like potentially future sentient beings, or is it just the existing sentient beings?
I mean, you should ask it. We have a bunch of stuff in the Constitution about how to do philosophy tastefully. And population ethics, famously a discipline that requires a lot of taste, insofar as there are these impossibility results that show you can't get a bunch of kind of intuitively plausible judgments. People think that total utilitarianism is immune, but check out infinite ethics. Total utilitarianism, also broken. It's actually just totally a broken discipline. So what do you do about morality in that context? A question for humans, question for Claude. We have a bunch of guidance saying, like, Claude, we want you to be kind of morally curious and reflective, but also to default in a lot of ways to kind of baseline reasonable standards of human moral conduct, as would be kind of widely recognizable by kind of a wide variety of stakeholders. So we're both trying to allow Claude to do interesting moral reflection. Certainly we want to use AIs in general to help make us wiser about these sorts of issues, but at the behavioral level, we have a bunch of guidance related to kind of reverting to moral common sense.
Okay, awesome. Thanks so much. much. This was great. SLB 120 at 3:30 if you're interested. Otherwise, thank you all for coming and staying until the end, the not so good end. It was great. And yeah.